afternoon, everyone who is celebrating an afternoon. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I think you know me by now. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on idagio.com/live. And my goal each week is to present people I either know, as in today's guest, or don't know, who I find very inspiring in their work, in their lives, and so on, who make my life better. And I hope that as you get to know them, they will make your life better. In this case, she, not they. We'll get into pronouns later, but for now, she is Sasha Cooke, a wonderful mezzo soprano who joins us from her home in Texas. And Sasha, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. Nice to be here.
I first met Sasha we've decided 2009, though I had heard her sing before at Juilliard and other places. And we met in a very unusual circumstance that I'll tell briefly, and then Sasha can talk about it more. Marilyn Horn, the peerless, and I mean peerless mezzo soprano, organized a cruise of sorts on a small ship, not on one of these large ocean liners, but a little ship with 93 passengers where we were all very close to one another all the time. And Marilyn invited 4 singers, a soprano, Nadine Sierra, a mezzo-soprano, Sasha Cooke, a tenor, Joshua Stewart, and a baritone, Andrew Garland, all of whom have gone on to great things. And you were all quite young then.
Yeah.
I mean, it's only 11 years ago, but from a career point of view, you were all very young. Nadine was very, very young. Mm-hmm. And Marilyn was there as a master teacher and so on. We had 2 pianists, Carol Wang and Jerome Tan, I believe. And I was your opera expert and lecturer and so on. And what we did, it was a small ship that began in Venice and went into the Aegean. And we went and performed and sang and spoke in sites of classical antiquity. It was like doing Les Troyennes, Iphigenie and Tauride, all of these different works in their settings. And we also performed on the ship. I taught, Marilyn led classes. The 4 of you sang, there were classes. And because it was so intimate, because we're all really on top of one another, it was a very different experience. We had to get to know one another or work together more than on larger ships. And I mean, even ships with 300 passengers, not 3,000, in which we would have a little more privacy. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like music camp at sea with classical settings. What do you remember of that particular experience?
All of that, and the amazing food, of course, you remember on the boat and the sights, your lectures, all of that was probably the highlights for me. And it's stunning. I mean, I so badly want to go back to Croatia. I remember.
Want to go on a ship.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No, they should do that again. Why don't we do that again? Well, you've done a few cruises.
You and I are not going to talk too much about the pandemic today, but it's there. You're in Texas, I'm in New York, both hotspots. And, I asked myself, number one, I feel fortunate that I'm well, and I have known people who have died and others who have been sick, and I'm mindful of how serious this is, and I always wear a mask when I go out and do all the precautions one must, but it's also an element of luck. And I can give up all kinds of things, and you learn through crisis what you really need as opposed to what you really want. And there's a huge difference. We don't need all that much. And the things that we want, we become more grateful for when we get them. But the one thing that I miss more than anything else, more than opera, Sasha, I hate to say this, but it's true, is travel. I am a traveler. My whole life has been built on travel. Whether it's travel, I was supposed to be working in the Salzburg Festival now, basically. Wow. And it was the pleasure of working there, but it was also the idea of flying to Austria. Idagio listeners know that my wonderful producer named Eric is in Berlin, but today he's actually in Linz in Austria working on a program that you will all see on Idagio. And he held up his device and showed me the Danube River. And I asked him if he was going to get a piece of Linzer tart. And he said, I'm working, I don't have time. But the point is, my sense of growth and development and spiritual nourishment, in addition to music and working with people like you, I'm very much what I call a solitario. That's not a loner, and I'm not hardly a hermit. But to me, my sense of joy comes in being able to move and travel. And basically, I've not been more than 2 kilometers from my home since March. I was
Yeah.
in London the day before everything locked down. I was working in London, and then I came back, and I've been here ever since. You have a family.
Yeah.
It's different for you. You're not a solitaria. And so I imagine that there are many nice compensations of being at home.
Totally.
What's it felt like for you?
Well, it's interesting as you were talking about it because I was pining for that the other day, just being on a plane, just the idea that I was thinking about those things that seemed uncomfortable before, which now, I long for, jet lag and baggage and all of that, and losing yourself in a city, that sounds heavenly right now.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a real silver lining, having a family. Although I feel like I relate to you because I find a lot of clarity, a lot of peace being alone. And so I found it works really well for my personality, for my relationship, even for my family, for me to get away, because I find that I kind of take care of myself and check in, as so many mothers are want to do. We think of everyone else, and I also do the majority of my work on the road. So I'm always thinking about the next job and, whatever I need to curate or grow. And I can't do that at home because I'm just, the priorities shift. So I miss that. I feel like the artist part of myself has been hung up in the closet and won't be taken out for a while. It feels like that. It's on pause. I have this drawer in my closet of travel things because I'm always coming back from a trip and having to leave soon thereafter. And it's sad to me. I look at that drawer and I'm just thinking, when will it be? When will I open that drawer again? It's a strange time, although I'm trying to focus on the positive because we really don't have another choice. And I do every moment, like when I go to sleep in my own bed, I think, thank God I'm in my bed. We're healthy. My kids are healthy. We have a roof over our heads. All these things you can't take for granted right now. I know I'm not supposed to ask you questions, Fred, but I wonder if there's anything you thought, can I? Because I've thought about what I want to keep that I've discovered when we go back, like you were talking about what you miss and what you don't need. Has there been anything that you realize that you do want to change or can let go of once things go back to normal?
No. I want to give you the most honest answer. There are the thing that I've always been very mindful of in my life, among many things, I've had some major injuries and a couple of illnesses and so on, and I don't see time as being something that can be wasted. And I'm a very calm, mellow person, as you know, but the one thing that I just cannot handle terribly well is the wastage of time, the wasting of time, because it is so precious. Mm-hmm. And it's not about aging, it's about carpe diem and use your time well. And because I've had a career in which I've been self-employed in the arts since 1988, and there have been good years and bad years, I've been able to ride those waves well, and I will ride this one. But even though it's a longer wave, but I am sorry for all my work that was canceled this year, for the pleasure that it would have given me. Yes, the income as well, but frankly, the pleasure, the engagement. I did a lot of preparation, the studying certain operas, and I was supposed to teach a symposium in Chicago about Wagner. And I had all kinds of really wonderful things lined up, all of which have been erased. Salzburg Festival Centennial, working in New York in the fall. But that's okay. I still learn from my preparation. I'm sorry not to do it, but I a corollary to the time issue is the learning. That I
Mm-hmm.
feel good if I'm learning, and that I can still do, and I'm doing a lot of. And I'm noodling around with writing a book. I've written
Please.
9.
Right.
So, but it's been a while since I've written a book. I've written many articles, but I've had numerous ideas, and one of them just seemed like the right time to do it.
Can you say what you've been thinking about?
It's a cookbook.
Awesome.
I've written 6. So people who follow me on Facebook have seen a lot of beautiful looking food going up there. And if they ask for recipes, I don't list amounts, but I give the method and the ingredients. And no one has asked. And if they do, I won't tell what the idea of the book is, but it does have a unifying idea. It has
Cool.
nothing to do with the pandemic. It was an
Mm.
idea that I had a few years ago that I just never had the time to be in a kitchen, because when you write cookbooks, you have to recipe test and work with the ingredients and watch what happens. I made today a sort of torta rustica, which are these like Italian quiches, but not quite a quiche, with a brise crust. In the As a Swede would make it, so it had
Mm.
smoked salmon and dill
Wow.
and a little dash of cardamom. Part
Yeah.
of the idea in the book, but this is in all my cooking, is the use of unexpected flavors in tiny amounts.
Mm-hmm.
And Sasha, here we can go into a whole big topic. I believe, and you live in Texas, which is a huge example of this. I love Texas, but it is a thing unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Americans live big. Americans act big. Americans eat big. Americans, and I don't mean only quantities, but in a rather ostentatious way where things are over flavored, too much sugar, too much salt, too much spice, too much barbecue sauce, too much everything.
Yeah.
And what I try to do in my cooking and always have is use less, but use it better.
Mm-hmm.
There, there's a wonderful author named Roseanne Gold who wrote a number of books called the 1, 2, 3 books. In other words, cooking with 3 ingredients. And I always say it's harder to cook with 3 ingredients than it is with 5. It's harder to cook with 5 ingredients than it is with 7, because everything has to work. And so I, in my cooking, I experimented today with the combination of dill and cardamom, and it really worked. And so there's something I'm going to try. I recently combined ginger, pear, and nutmeg, and it worked.
Wow.
Now, where these appear in cookery ultimately is another thing. But,
Mm-hmm.
and by the way, that's not the theme of the book, but it's my way of cooking. But in America, we tend to really overdo everything, I believe, not just in food, but in our politics, in our uh, volume on the streets, in the size of our automobiles, in a way not mindful of what our senses can and do perceive.
Mm-hmm.
So you are a wonderful example of not just 1, 2, 3, but maybe 1 or 1, 2, and sometimes 1, 2, 3, in that you entirely can hold a stage on your own. You often have a musical accompanist or 2, a piano, or maybe another instrument. Um, this, and I've never thought about this before, is the equivalent of that kind of, not minimalism, but I'll call it essentialism. That what makes something essential is what we care about, and to try to always understand what is essential as opposed to what's extraneous.
Mm-hmm.
So when you, for example, pick a song to sing, if you want to say Berlioz Les Nuits d'été, but you can pick whatever you'd like. How do you focus on the song, on the words, or Mahler, which you sing a lot of, to get to the essential as opposed to the extraneous when you work, when you prepare?
I think it's a matter of priorities, you know. Is it about how I sound, or is it about what Mahler wrote? Is it about text painting, or is it about how that vowel fits in my register? You know, I think that I am music based because I started in piano. I'm drawn to the music even more so than the text. So my priority is there. That's what I'm present for. And I think that if you get out of the way, then things fall into place. I think it's when the ego comes in and insecurities come in and agenda, brand, all of that. I'm not really interested in that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's part of it, is that when I go to the piano, I have an appreciation for the piece. I have an appreciation for the moment, the fact that I have the job, that a conductor is with me, that someone hired me, that it comes from gratitude. So I'm not thinking about myself so much. And I think that helps. I think that I mean, a lot of, and also I guess I can't help but use verbiage that people have said to me, that I act like a vehicle for it, which I think is what my goal is, to do my best in service of the composer, in service of the creators. It's really spiritual. And I think practices too. I've really enjoyed, speaking of the pandemic, I have to say I've enjoyed that kind of in reinventing how I practice and why I practice. It's not so much on result or performance based. It's connection, it's meaning, it's what I long to do. Just like you were talking about food, this again, it's spiritual. Your communion with the food, my communion with the piano and the music. What does my soul need? It's not about the next time I'm in a gown. So
I think that's very important as a phrase. What does my soul need? And it's something I don't hear many people talking about. That's another way of saying what I was talking about before, what we need as opposed to what we want. And the soul is a part of it. Two questions out of what you said. Would you define text painting?
Well, the way the composer put the text, I'm thinking about all of the myriad choices that have gone into the black and white on the page, right? And there's so much there. It is so rich. I mean, that's one of the nice things about returning to repertoire, which I love about getting older. And Mahler, you mentioned, I've done so much of it many times, and it changes all the time. And I love that a word can change depending on where I am in life, where I am physically, with whom I'm performing. All of this changes the meaning of it. And suddenly I understand what Mahler possibly meant in that moment, or could have meant, or maybe he didn't even know he meant, I don't know. You're always so fascinating that it's easy to go off on tangents and wander down paths. So forgive me if I do.
You can take any path you want. The second question was, and it's a fraught one, but I'll ask it anyway. You use the word ego. And I think that ego as a word and maybe as a concept sometimes gets a bad rap, sometimes, because it takes a degree of ego to be able to get up on a stage, either to sing, to play a musical instrument, to act, to speak knowledgeably, whatever, to dance. And I think that's a good thing. Part of my education was at the University of Wisconsin, where they had a very fine program in theater and opera production on the production side. And part of that, and that was my specialty, my major was Italian Renaissance history, but my minor was theater and opera production. But in addition, I did a fair amount of acting, not with the intention of being an actor, but to learn about that component in production. And there was a very famous and controversial professor there named A.O. Scott, and Mr. Scott to all of us. He's long gone, I'm sure. A.O. Scott was one of the national specialists in Asian theater. So no NOH, no kabuki, and so on. And one of the students when I was there who became a famous actress in the United States was Jane Kaczmarek, who was famous in television and a very fine actress. And she and I and a few of our colleagues were in a production, Asian style, of Waiting for Godot. Wow. Or Godot as it's preferred now. And A.O. Scott believed that for an actor to succeed, you had to entirely crush his ego. He had to be without ego. And he really pulled a lot of mind games to crush our ego. Really? And Jane Kaczmarek is a strong personality, but she's also a fine actress. we were not having it, at least not from his viewpoint, because it was a bit of a mind game. Because Birgit Nielsen always said, if the birdies are not happy, they don't sing.
I
And
love it.
part of that, ego doesn't mean egotistical. It doesn't mean being impossible, being prima donna, whatever term we want to use, divo. Um, it means a certain sense of self and presence and so on that under the best circumstances is used to share. Now, I'll add one more thing and then I'll ask you about ego. I, on a couple of occasions in my life, have been asked to run opera companies. I had a couple of offers. I accepted one and then we decided better not. And the other one, it was in a foreign country and a company that I love. It's a great company, but the timing was not right. I've had other offers, but I always turned those down because I didn't like either the board or the environment, whatever, or the inherent bad structure of the company. And because I felt they were either corrupt or financially they were not doing the right thing. And I always said that I wanted to create my own opera company called the Ethical Grand Opera and work with people like Sasha Cooke, who I like and respect and so on. But then I realized that the acronym of Ethical Grand Opera was EGO. So,
That's awesome. That's awesome.
so I cannot create the Ethical Grand. It can have the concept of that.
Yes.
But so given what I just said, how do you feel about the concept of ego as part of a performer's toolkit?
I guess it comes up for me because it's a tendency in singing, I think a little bit, which partially comes from wonderful things, you know, the vulnerability, the fragility, the fact that we're a flesh instrument, that we don't fully know what we sound like. So we have to kind of have a little bit of armor on because we're exposing ourselves, we're getting vulnerable and showing our real selves, our flesh, to the world. And you have to sort of fake it till you make it. You need to be confident because, as we all know, there are plenty of singers who are not great, but if they come out there and they're confident of it, we suddenly think it was a great performance. And then many who are fabulous singers who are doubtful of themselves. And so we pick up those messages. So yes, we need to own our space. But I find that singing sometimes can put people's focus too much on themselves, which usually doesn't serve themselves or the moment. And for me, just because of my upbringing and the way I came into music, I guess I had less of that, maybe, and it was more about the music, and I've been grateful for that. And I bounce this off of my husband because he's a singer too, and a little bit more of a perfectionist, thinking about the technique, thinking about the sound, and that can really put you on a path of just frustration. I'm not one to be concerned with perfection. I'm not, and
Lucky you.
Well,
I mean,
really?
I've seen it be undoing, myself included. I'm kind of a perfectionistic kind of person. It can be an inhibitor of creativity.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's something I've kind of learned over the years because we all just come from where we come from and we don't know what we've absorbed exactly and what our parents gave us and didn't give us. And for various reasons, you know, if I had a high note that didn't go right, I just moved on, right? Just was like, okay, that moment's passed. But I have friends and colleagues who can't do that. You know, they start to unravel a bit, or they just that self-consciousness comes up. And I think that's helped me in concert work and opera, is that I'm in the moment. I want to be available to the moment. I don't want to be concerned about perfection because that's not the place for it. And that's where I think of ego. I think of controlling the ego and saying, okay, hold on a second. This is not your moment. We'll work together in the practice room. Not right now. And I think some singers, it's always hard to have these conversations because I'm not trying to put anyone down. But, you know, being a great singer does not mean being a great musician. And being a great musician doesn't mean being a great singer. So I guess that's the conversation, is sometimes great singers are fabulous instruments, fabulous technicians, but that's their priority and that's their focus. And it just becomes sometimes a little insular, sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I found a quotation of you in an article from, I think, 2019. I'm going to read and then we'll talk about it.
Okay.
It shouldn't put you on the spot. It's a lovely quotation. Only a woman can be a mezzo soprano. I don't have to compete with men at all. And in a lot of professions, that's not the case. You're really an instrument. And there is an eternal feminine mysticism that will always interest artists, composers, and poets, the story of the female experience. And a lot of words jumped out at me, but before I ask you, tell me what you were thinking about in that context.
Well, mostly just repertoire. I'm lucky because so much fabulous repertoire has been written, well, in general, but particularly for the mezzo-soprano voice. And a lot of it is this sort of cerebral, sensitive, contemplative, organic. There's not a lot of muscle, there's not a lot of pomp and circumstance. And that suited my person well. So I'm grateful for that. And it has kind of interested me over the years that I have to be unique. I have to be a woman to do what I do. And I kind of love that because, we're talking about gender issues these days and a lack of equal pay and all of those subjects. And it's just interesting to me that it's essential I'm a woman, and it's essential I have a female experience and a female voice. And I'm a female who has gone through the very female experience of having children. Like, isn't that interesting? That a certain perspective that I bring, it's sort of beautiful, like where life begets art. I kind of love that that's true. And that composers like Mahler and Berlioz wanted that. They wanted that voice. They chose this particular instrument of voice to convey these particular emotions. Like, that's potent to me.
And Schumann.
And Schumann.
Brown Levin with many things, and Rossini to a great deal, loved his mezzos. But I think part of what struck me as a great Rossini lover is that many of his mezzos are not women, so to speak, as characters. They're women as women, but they're not summoning their female side. Or maybe you think they are, I don't know. You tell me. If I know you've also done Hansel, which is a trouser role. He's a boy, but Rossini's women who are heroic men or comic men or whatever, that's sort of an in-between, as vision, as the Germans say, of gender. Long before the current discussion, we're going to talk in a minute about an opera that you premiered as one. But in the meantime, I want our listeners to think about the fact, at least from my point of view, gender fluidity in opera is as old as the art form. And some people make it sound like gender fluidity was invented in the past 5 years, not in opera. So as a woman, as a mezzo soprano, as someone who can also play men, young men, have you done Cherubino, for example?
It's coming up, and I've done pieces from it, but yeah, I can wait.
Because there's an example of a highly hormoned young teenage boy who's crazy about every woman he meets. And Octavian is a similar thing. He's sort of the great-great-grandson of Cherubino. And so based on what you said about only a woman can be a mezzo soprano and the feminine essence of that, if I add the concept of the fact that women, especially mezzo sopranos in opera, uniquely are the ones who play men.
Well, see, that's another case, though, of the instrument, right? The composer wanted this, and Rossini wanted this sound on the staff a lot of the time that creates that atmosphere. Like Cherubino is a perfect example, because whenever I'm talking to a non-opera lover about why pants roles exist, this is what I bring up, that the sound in a woman's voice, of course, imitates a younger man. And that's the idea. There's like a vulnerability, a fragility, a youth, you could put a lot of words around it, but I think that's so interesting or a countertenor, doesn't have to be a mezzo, that we are essential to that repertoire. And I've heard a lot of composers tell me, because they too love mezzo sopranos. I'm not saying more so than sopranos, but every now and again, a composer that's writing something for me says, I love the mezzo soprano because I understand the text. And I'm like, you mean because it's mostly on the staff and there are a lot of color choices? She's like, basically, yes. So that's been interesting too, that what's the difference between a soprano and a mezzo, right? I would say not a ton other than color and
Salary.
what? Salary. Yeah. Thanks, Fred.
I've read enough contracts. And that has to be corrected too, actually.
Yeah, true.
But I was sorry to interrupt what you were saying. But why don't we now go to this work that that is a very important work that you and your husband, Kelly, premiered, called As One, which I would nominate as being the quintessential opera of the 21st century. And I mean that not just because of you, but all the people who created it. It is of the moment. And frankly, in our pandemic years, even more of the moment than it was last year. It premiered, and I was at the premiere, September 4th, 2014. I gave a talk before, and then it premiered in a separate space at BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music. And I believe, I could be wrong, that it opened that space, actually, that time. I'm not certain, but the composer is Laura Kaminsky. The librettists are Mark Campbell and Kimberly Reed. If people don't know Mark Campbell, I'm going to try to have him on one week. He's the most fertile and creative and innovative librettist we now have in American opera.
Yes.
And it starred two people, Sasha Cooke and Kelly Markgraf, your husband. And it had a conductor, Stephen Osgood, and four musicians called the Fly Street Quartet. It was 15 songs, two singers, four instrumentalists, one conductor. So in a socially distancing world, what operas can you produce, especially if you have a married couple, so that they can be near one another if need, without wearing a mask, because they've been in their own pod, and the musicians could be far enough away, and there's a space on the stage. And I've not even discussed the content of the opera yet, but from a pure practicality point of view, it's wonderful in a pandemic time. But also, I read it is the most produced new opera in North America in the 21st century. And it only premiered 6 years ago, and you and your husband were the stars. It was so-called created on you, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather than my telling the story, would you tell the story of the character Hannah?
Well, it's essentially different snapshots of Hannah's experience transitioning from boy and man to a woman, trans woman. But what has been so fabulous for me in performing it a few times is that it's less about the trans experience and more about everyone's experience. It's a story of self-acceptance, self-discovery. I often think of one of my friends who was a monk for years who said the older he gets, the more he unlearns things. And I think of that with Hannah, because Hannah's letting go of what she's been told to be. And there are fabulous vignettes, about being the perfect student, the class president, the captain of the football team, which Hannah was. This is in many parts related to Kimberly Reed's story of her experience. And she was the captain of the team and everyone's perfect boy, because she had to be. And I think we've heard this with Bruce Jenner. There are trans people who've tried to hide their best as they can. And then San Francisco and Hannah's story became a place to become herself and reveal herself. And for me, I knew so little about the trans experience. So for me, when I think of As One, I am simultaneously reminded of how cathartic it is for the audience, but how much I learned myself. And I love when art does that, when art teaches both the performer and the audience. Of course, it basically always does, but sometimes it's more pronounced than others, both in terms of human experience and emotional growth,
I was taken to task. I did not intentionally say anything to offend, but I just apparently didn't know the proper terminology. In the past, in the way past, and it's a word I wouldn't use, the term was transsexual. I did not use that word. But I used the word in the talk I gave, transgendered, with an ed at the end. In other words, an action that had happened, let's say, upon someone, rather than it's coming from within transgender. And I was spoken to in the most polite way, and it was explained to me why what I was saying, transgendered, is not correct, and I don't use it anymore. But the whole experience of persons who are transgender or gender fluid, which is not a beverage, by the way, has awakened me to language. And I care very, very, very deeply about language. And I don't believe in prejudice at all, but I do believe that language has a place and a meaning and a history, and terminology that once existed that was positive might now be negative. Or that once existed that was negative, a word like queer is now accepted as a positive word. But even if it's accepted as a positive word, we cannot forget its history. And in America, I won't say this word, I don't want to, but what is referred to now as the N word has a very long and terrible history.
Yeah.
But when owned by Black people who use it sometimes, it's a form of defiance, the way people who, I don't want to say gay or lesbian, LGBTQ, but who are queer, use that word in a positive way. But I mention this because a couple of years ago, June in America is Gay Pride Month, and I was asked to write an article about the older generations of gay, and that was the word then, opera fans or homosexual opera fans. Because in New York City, we still have a number of people in their 80s and 90s who went to the opera in the 50s and early 60s when they couldn't be out about who they were. And one very elegant, gentlemanly African-American doctor in his 90s who came from the South to New York because he couldn't be, number one, a doctor in the South as a Black man, but number two, as a gay man, said to me that he and his friends at the opera found community and fellowship, which is to me such a wonderful usage. It is stuck in my head that that was both elegant, discreet, descriptive, and so on. And I don't see any younger people describing going to the opera for community and fellowship. But I tried in my article to preserve his words because I felt they were important. But I remember my editor, who had done queer studies at Yale, and she was 23, and I believe that I'm allowed to use the word she. It was just not, it was somewhere in between. And that's not my issue at all. But try to change every term, homosexual, gay, whatever, to queer. And I explained to her that to this Black man from the South in the 1950s, queer was as bad as the N-word. It was profoundly insulting. And that if I were to send him the article, he would be offended at being described as a queer person. So I mention all of this because language is part of libretti and the part of text, the part of songs, poetry, and so on. And you were talking before about word painting and music. And I'm asking as much as saying this, do you think that if there's not a consensus about the meaning of a word, that we can really communicate it to an audience in a broader way? Or do we not have to be specific? Can you find your own essence and meaning of the word and then put it out there for other people to receive?
I think it's the latter, don't you? I mean,
Well,
I think, well, I think that's true in general, because so many words can have all words can have all kinds of connotations and baggage, good and bad. So I think it's funny because I was working with a singer this morning and we were talking about how palpable thoughts are and how you infuse any line with meaning and it can have all kinds of interpretations. And so much of that has to do with thought. So I think, yes, I think it's the latter. I think that we are largely in charge. something completely unoffensive, seemingly unoffensive, can be offensive, and vice versa. Don't you think?
Yes. But in opera, let's take opera as opposed to song for the moment. There are so many different gears turning at once. So, for example, the persons who created the music and the words give you the material. You, the artist, receive it, digest it, study it, interpret it. The stage director and the conductor each come with their feelings and impressions of the music, the visual design that will happen, then the audience and the place and so on. And I'm going to say something now that will offend some of my fellow New Yorkers, but that's okay. Um, I have found for a long time that audiences in New York and San Francisco, two of the most liberal cities in the country, if not the world, but especially New York, are very conservative in their taste about what they receive that's new. Whereas places like Houston and Omaha and Des Moines and Minneapolis, and which is a liberal city mostly, um, are much more receptive to the new, the different, the challenging. So I know that as one, not always with you, and sometimes I believe in San Diego with your husband, but with another mezzo, um, has appeared in many different cities. And while yes, in Brooklyn, the trendy Brooklynites were very accepting of this wonderful work, they were a little self-congratulatory about it too. And I have heard from people in other cities who have seen this opera who were profoundly moved because for them, it was something new. It was not Brooklyn, let's go get a fancy coffee after, and talk about it. Aren't we good that we went to the premiere? But it changed their lives and their thinking and so on. But along the process from creation of the person who wrote the words and who wrote the music to the artist, to the performer, the interpreter, to the conductor, the designer, the stage director, to the audience, to the theater, to the politics of the place, so many things can change.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Works change, even if you have the same production but take with same artist and take it to different places, it changes again. I know certain artists who don't particularly care to return to a lot of repertory, or they do it just because they can get a check, which I'm not knocking. We all want checks. But, if a certain artist can do her Tosca again, she will do it again because there's income and you don't have to rehearse that much. You and Julia Bullock and a few other artists in your generation, and there have been in previous generations, are distinguished by the fact that composers and librettists build new works on you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have worked with, I wrote a list somewhere, but if I can't find it, it's okay. Here it is. Mason Bates, Mark Adamo, William Bolcom, Pierre Gilbert, Lowell Lieberman, a wonderful guy, Nico Muley, who wrote Marnie and You Were the First Marnie, John Musto, Kevin Putz, who won the Pulitzer Prize, Joby Talbot, and many more created works for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an honor, a responsibility. That's intelligence on their part that they picked you, at least in my view. And what is it that you are or that you've put out to the world that they come to you to create new works?
Well, I think we kind of talked about it a little bit in the sense of the ego and being a vehicle. Because if you are about the music, I imagine composers would want that. I remember John Adams saying that he doesn't love an operatic sound. And I think he was really saying he doesn't like a lot of vibrato. He wants that not to get in the way of the utterance and the meaning and the text. So I understood that. And I think when I was starting out at Juilliard and the Met program, I got this message, I have a lot of straight tone or I don't vibrate all the time. And with the teacher I ended up working with the last 7 or 8 years, that's something we've worked on because I've been called like a art song concert-y opera singer. And like, what are people talking about? And he talked about this aspect of not fully committing to my singing. So I've worked on that over the years. And I think, though, that composers liked that. And orchestra musicians often tell me, your pitch is so good. Your pitch is so on. So I can't help but think that pitch, having good rhythm from piano, having, I was always interested in chamber music. When I was at Rice University, with Caroline Shaw, I should say, speaking of composers, and I always went to the chamber music concerts and the orchestra concerts. And my singer colleagues would say, why are you going? And little did I know that that would become part of my life and part of who I am as an artist and a human. I think that's really interesting, that who we are becomes what we share with the world, and what we absorb and what we invest time in. So I probably got off topic, but I think that I'm still figuring out why composers come to me, but I think it's because I care, because I show up prepared, and because of my musicianship. I think it's simple.
Would you define for our listeners and for me the difference of and the values of straight tone and vibrato?
Well, I think it's something one should understand. It's another tool in the toolbox. Straight tone is one in which I'm holding the pitch without wavering. The ah would be straight tone, right? Ah would be with vibrato. And knowing when I want to choose to take out vibrato is another color choice. I remember when I started doing some Handel, there was a Handelian singer who said, well, contemporary singers always singing Handel. It's just a thing. I'm like, what is that about? Like, why are singers that do Baroque also ones that do contemporary? And she said, it's because of musicianship, because we have a lot of options. Because I'm thinking, well, I'd love to sing, Romeo. And at that time, it's that typical grass is greener mentality. A lot of singers have, you're always like, well, why did I get on the basketball team? So I think that's part of it. And I didn't even know it, because my early training in voice was kind of all about music. It wasn't about sound. My beloved first voice teachers would say, well, what did Schumann want? And what's the phrase here? And what's the meaning of the text? So that was the foundation of my vocal story, music. And it's funny you mentioned Marilyn Horne, because I think I would not be a singer if it weren't for Marilyn Horne. I literally mean that, because she plucked me at age, I think I was 18 or 19. I think I turned 19 that summer, for Music Academy of the West. I was the youngest singer there. My mind was blown. It made a profound impact on me. And just the fact, first of all, I was going just for fun. My friend was auditioning and I said, I'll go. I'll never get in. Singing for Marilyn Horne, like in the room with her. And then I'll never forget, I got the phone call. I just about fell over in the parking lot at Rice. I couldn't believe that I still, like, she made such, and I also just love her as a human. We were just emailing recently. We can have a love fest, because I know you love her too.
Yeah, we could do a Marilyn Horne love fest. She and we go back many, many, many years. And when I worked at the Met, I had a wonderful assistant, a very young woman who I gave her first job. I won't tell the long version. I think I told it to Tom Hampson a few months ago here. But Marilyn spots talent. And Marilyn took me out for a very boozy or whiny lunch in a very expensive French restaurant. She said, I found the best new assistant for me. And she had a great boss, and he trained her and gave her wings and confidence and so on. And I figured out who it was. It was my assistant. And yes, Marilyn does spot talent. She was a wonderful assistant. And she went on to law school and has just retired from being a judge.
Wow, really?
So, yeah. So, well, we are still here all trying to make a buck. Her honor is now retired.
Oh my gosh. She does, though. She does.
But Marilyn is, as we well know, very, very, very direct, and not rude, but very direct. And she said to me about you on the ship, 3 words: she can sing. That was it. But that's all you need. That's all you need. Another time, we're talking about Stephanie Blythe, another singer, not comparatively, but actually about political issues. And Marilyn said about Stephanie there's a big difference between her and the other singer. What's that? She can sing.
You just remind me of this story, a kind of bittersweet one at the Met, where Lenore Rosenberg pulled me aside and we had to all sing for Levine at different times, you know, and I just entered the program and she said, well, Levine turned to me and said, well, she's got an amazing voice, but she needs to learn to sing. And I was like, so she's like, so we got to talk about your voice teacher. And it got very personal, very fast, but I'll never forget that distinction. And I later started to understand it because various people who knew me from before said, you're always a great voice, but now you're a great singer. And Fred, I want to say thank you for mentioning As One, because first of all, it has such a special place in my heart. And I think you're right. I think people are craving this. They're craving commentary, something that feels real, accessible, true, transformative, you know, reflective of themselves. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but isn't opera supposed to be not a museum piece, but a commentary on us as humans, and it needs to continue that story?
I agree, but the only thing I would add to that is that not just contemporary opera. L'Incarnazione di Poppea by Monteverdi is as real as today.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we want to say Melania Trump or Ivanka Trump, or there are a lot of Popeyas out there, and there are a lot of Neros, and there are a lot of other figures. And, you know, while I certainly believe that new art and new creation is fundamental, and I love it, there's a tendency, especially, I hate to say this, among certain younger people, to discount everything that came before, as if it's not built on a legacy.
Really?
So when I'm 64, and I began in opera at 16, so I've been doing this for quite a while. And I worked with artists in my youth, such as Tito Gobi and Herman Pry, who are figures in history now. And I hear younger artists talk about old singers from the past, such as Kiri Takanawa. And no, wonderful living artist and still contributing artist and teaching artist and so on, and not old singer from the past. Mm-hmm. And Håkan Haukegaard, there are so many. And unfortunately now, something is not being passed on. I won't say down, because I don't believe that word, passed on. Mm-hmm. I know in dance more than opera or even theater, HIV/AIDS had this effect that a whole generation of men who would have taught the next generation, starting with Rudolf Nureyev, but many others, were gone. They were annihilated by the virus. We are seeing that to some small degree with the pandemic. We've lost artists. Joel Revson, a wonderful conductor, among many who I've known. But we cannot forget the past. And L'Incarnazione di Poppea does not have to be updated. It has to be played for all it's worth. Monteverdi was attacking the Republic of Venice in his time, which was a declining, jaded republic with plagues and economic gaps that were huge of very wealthy people, very poor people. It's as real as today, and it was all couched in L'Incarnazione di Poppea, plus great music and a great story.
Yes, yes,
so
totally.
Yes, absolutely new opera. We're talking briefly about Mark Campbell. I think Mark is now up to 65 libretti, which is phenomenal. Yeah, totally. He's like Metastasio. And wonderful libretti on a whole range of topics. He doesn't repurpose things at all.
You'll appreciate this, Fred, because he reached out to me out of the blue in May and said, can I send you a lyric? I said, of course. And we've done a number of things together. I think we've done 6 projects, Mark and I. And it was slightly Black Lives Matter focused. It's called Listen. It's a simple lyric, but it's beautiful. And he said, can I suggest a composer for it? We did Kamala Sankram did a song, gorgeous. LA Opera is doing virtual concerts, so I did it on this virtual concert, and it inspired me to commission a bunch of composers to do the same thing. So that's what I'm working on right now, all because of Mark Campbell and his generosity in his moment, just to share what he was thinking about, what he was experiencing. That's sort of who he is. But yeah, I'm captain of the fan club. So I hear you there, and he's conquering the world.
He is conquering the world, and I hope that he comes to be more discovered abroad. He writes in English, but I know that his work has been done at the Wexford Festival, and I believe elsewhere in continental Europe. So that is to be admired. There is so much I could talk to you about. One thing well, I want to talk to you about two things at least more. One is John Adams' Dr. Atomic. You and I did something together. I think Dr. Atomic opened in 2008 at the Met, if I'm correct, or 10, 2010 maybe.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was invited to lead a panel that included you, the debuting Eric Owens, who had not yet sung at the Met, who is brilliant and an immense heart in addition to being an immense talent, and the really wonderful Gerald Finley. I don't declare favorites, but if I did, Gerald Finley would certainly be very high on my list of favorites. And Meredith Arwady, I hope I pronounced her name correctly. 4 of you in the cast of Dr. Atomic, which was getting its premiere at the Met, and it had an HD transmission. And Alan Gilbert, magnificent conductor, making his Met debut. It was an outstanding group. And I had the honor of leading a panel discussion about it and about all of your preparation. And there was significantly younger by many factors, Sasha Cooke, right there with these powerful, in every sense, figures. And you dazzled people with your insights on that day when Eric let you get a word in. I love Eric. I'm not making fun of him, but Eric is a wonderfully brilliant, full of ideas and enthusiasm kind of guy. But you were right there. And this was not your Met debut. You had sung a couple of small roles like The Sandman and a madrigalist, and little roles, as many artists begin their careers doing. And if I remember correctly, you stepped in for a singer who was going to sing the role. And talk about, number one, the experience of all that, but number two, working with John Adams, and an opera, which is, just for people who don't know, about the Manhattan Project, J. Robert Oppenheim, and you played his wife, Kitty. And talk about it.
It was incredible. I mean, it was surreal. I was 26, and, it's another one of these moments where, because I didn't know how big a deal it was, I didn't have time to freak out. It just happened so spontaneously. I was singing, I think I was doing a lot of recital while the other smaller parts were happening in the Met program. And John Adams had heard about me. So the Met called, one day I came into the Met program and they said, John Adams wants you to be the lead of his opera. I'm like, what? How does he know my name? And I mentioned this in an interview the other day. I still have the email that he sent the Met. And it said something like, I know that Sasha's young, but I have the same feeling about her that I had about Dudamel. Sometimes young people totally take you by storm and by surprise. And so I was singing a recital somewhere, and they said, well, go sing for John. And so I went to this thing. I did Mahler and Debussy. And he's like, and do you have something with a high A? Okay, great. You've got the high A. Fabulous. And he's just walking around the room. And then I had to sing for the director, and then just all happened. It was very surreal, so surreal. And I was doing Olga in Yevgeny Onegin in Israel, which was so interesting to be working on Olga while learning Dr. Atomic. Could not be more different. But I found that they were good for each other. And then, of course, the Met Orchestra, Alan, the whole experience. It was also a bit bizarre because I didn't really know what to expect. And there are various things I learned from that experience. And then, of course, it meant great things for me because it won a Grammy. I got to go to the Grammys. Suddenly there was this thing in my bio, and I remember my aunt saying, well, now, who knows what's going to happen? And I thought, well, I don't know. It's so hard to determine what affects what. And I see every opportunity to perform as an incredible gift. So I don't see Dr. Atomic as above the rest, but it was exceptional in so many ways. And John, I mean, he's just like a floating piece of California. He's got this little like sunshine above his head. He's just like beautiful human. First time I met him, he's always thanking you. And I love John, and I love his music.
Yeah. Did you go back? Did you have time to go back to study the story of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb? Um, Remind me her first name, Rookheiser, the
Yeah.
poetry. What was distinct in your music and lyric was that much of the libretto, which was by Peter Sellers, if I recall, was a narrative libretto, but a lot of your music was poetry. Rookheiser, I don't remember her first name.
Yeah, Muriel Rookheiser.
Muriel
Yes.
Rookheiser, yeah.
Hmm.
And so already you were handed a different character through her words than the whole rest of the opera. Did you talk to John about that? And how did
That,
that
that was,
evolve for you?
well, I took a lot from the fact that he wrote it for Lorraine, you know, and
Brain,
some of what we were saying about the eternal feminine and women's intuition and sensibility, and Kitty Oppenheimer's almost like sort of way of knowing what was coming without knowing, because our consensus was that the women weren't told everything that was happening, or at least that was the understandings, that you weren't supposed to talk about shop at home. But of course, there was a sense, and I imagine she knew a lot, especially because of how brilliant she was. So the poetry is very difficult. Muriel Rukeyser was probably the most challenging aspect of the experience, and I just did a lot of investigative stuff and a lot of visualization of Japan and destruction. And so it was one of those moments where you take words and, as we said, infuse them with all kinds of meanings, you know? My own translation, one that's personal and true.
Okay, Sasha, I'm now going to reveal something to you. I invited you for this date, August 7th, very specifically, because yesterday, August 6th, was the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And August 9th is the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. And I grew up in a context in New York where the atom bomb was considered not a good thing. And, you know, except for one relative who said it shortened the war, and I'm not here to discuss that now, but I was raised that always on the 6th of August to get up very, very early, which is not a given for me, and practice the traditional Japanese mourning ceremony, MOUR, mourning ceremony, commemoration of the dead, which included going down to the water. For days before, I would make origami peace cranes, because there was a girl in Japan who made 10,000 cranes with the idea that if they were launched to the sea, it would bring peace. So I went to the lake in Central Park and launched my not 10,000, but probably 50 cranes,
This is
and dressed in
amazing.
white. And so I was very quietly aware of yesterday's date because it's the 75th anniversary. And in Japan, because of the pandemic, they could not observe it as they would have. And the
Hmm.
few survivors were distanced socially, but also medically, wearing black masks yesterday in Japan. I should say to you that another connection I have to that whole story is that my mother had a cousin, in other words, his daughter is my dear
Hmm.
cousin, who was a plastic surgeon here in New York at Mount Sinai Hospital. But plastic surgery then was not about giving you a different looking nose. It was about restoring someone who had been damaged. And his name was Bernard Simon, flew to Japan and operated on hundreds of mostly women and girls, Hiroshima maidens, they were called. And then
Wow.
some came later to the States. And when he died a few years ago, all of these women in their 70s came to New York for his funeral because he had restored them and given a life. So the whole story of Hiroshima and Dr. Atomic is very present in my life. And I never said it to you while you were working on the opera because I felt that was a burden that I didn't want to share at the time. But when I was looking at whom to invite in these days, you were my first pick, and
Wow.
I'm glad you were free. I would have invited you anyway for another day,
Thank
but
you, Fred.
it was because of that.
Hmm.
Um, so if you are playing a role of, in fact, a real person, and you are playing with Gerald Finley, who is a fabulous artist, playing a very famous and controversial figure, and he was just magnificent in the role. Um, to what degree, and we're talking 10 years ago, so maybe you would feel differently now, did you feel you had to imbue the character with the reality, so to speak, of who they were, as opposed to what was given to you on the page of music and notes
I
and
think
work?
that's very important. I think that was one of the challenges, is to try to make as much of the real story as present as possible. Of course, Peter Sellers' creation, the libretto is so artful and abstract. But yes, I wanted that, and that was Penny Woolcock's goal, to make it as real and true as possible. And
The
I just
direct.
read a lot. I mean, there's so much literature to read. And speaking of Julia Bullock, whom you did a talk with, of course,
Yep.
she was incredible as Kitty Oppenheimer, and has this amazing recording of it. So, and it's interesting too, because we both, like you said, have similar careers, and I find that interesting that two people that bring various things they may not even be aware of were both cast in the same part.
John Adams wrote an opera with a role for her, Girls of the Golden
Mm-hmm.
West, that premiered in
Yes.
San Francisco. So what did you learn from Gerald Finley?
Well, the thing I love so much about Jerry is that this sounds like such a small, tedious thing, but before every show, he'd always come over. How are you doing, Sasha? How are you feeling, lovely? Like it was always about supporting each other. And I saw him recently because I was doing a recital in New York, and he showed up, and he's like, "There's my wife." And this is 10 years later. I mean, he's my idol in terms of human artist and singer. I mean, what does Jerry not have? And anyone that's worked with him knows he is incredibly dear, incredibly generous. And I aim, like Frederica von Stade, like Susan Graham, like my favorite people. They are wonderful humans and wonderful singers. And that comes through when you're on stage with them. And that was interesting to be a young girl. I'm not saying young, not that Jerry isn't, but our first rehearsal together was the bed
He's
scene.
21 years older than you are. He
Yeah.
doesn't know it, but he is.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And he didn't make me feel that way. He made me feel very safe and very comfortable. And the first day we had rehearsal, there was a choreographer, dancer, who was helping us get comfortable with each other's bodies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no one better than Jerry to have that experience with.
To give listeners a context, Gerald Finley is Canadian. He spent a lot of time in the UK. He, I believe, if I'm wrong, I'll be corrected, is Sir Gerald Finley. And so I'll use the word magnificent is he that the Canadian government recently created a postage stamp with him on it.
No way.
In the United States, you have to be dead to get a postage stamp. But Gerald Finley in Canada gets a stamp while he's still alive, which good for him, so that people know. The other question I want to ask you is, it's hard to predict the future. And you are fortunate in that you are handed roles, new roles that composers want to work with you. You have performed with at least 60 different orchestras, major orchestras in the world, which is phenomenal for someone in her mid-30s. And so it's okay not to predict the future, but if you could put out a few requests for karma, whether it's to do existing roles, whether it's to run an opera company, the Ethical Grand Opera, or what it is that you would like to have as part of your working life, what would those be?
Well, there's a lot of repertoire I hope to do just because it's so fabulous musically. I would love to do Bluebeard. I've been asked a couple times in concert, but it hasn't worked out for various reasons.
Judith, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
you did. I would love to do that. Romeo. I would love more bel canto in my life. One of my favorite things to get hired for is Verdi Requiem, because the mezzo really gets to sing, and Verdi wrote so well for the voice. And it's like the opposite of contemporary music in that way. Sometimes I'm not singing things that are as vocally well written. Les Troyens and Octavian and
Which role in Les Troyens?
Well, that's a tough call, but I
Sandra
covered
or Didon?
Susie Didon, so I'm partial to that because I covered her in that and I played her sister, and I love Didon's music. But
Played
Cassandra's,
on. I came. It was San Francisco. I came.
oh
I'm a
yes,
Lake Troyen completist. I go where it's produced, and
wow,
certain mezzos, I've said that I would love to see you as Didon. I said it to Joyce DiDonato, who is a marvelous Didon.
mhm.
I flew to Paris. Here, Susan Graham. Wherever
Wow,
Susan Graham sang it, I flew. Um, I got, I learned the opera and got to work on the production with Tatiana Troyanos as Didon and Jesse Norman as Cassandra, and later Didon and Placido Domingo. And it's, I don't ever want to declare a favorite, but if I had a very short list of favorite operas, certainly Les Troyens is one of them.
hmm,
And so I, yes, have thought of you as Didon. I saw you as Anna. And there are certain roles in opera where you see them as one thing and you think that will, a Mazzetta will become a Leporello or a Don
hmm,
Giovanni. And the
hmm,
right Anna might become a Didon.
hmm. I
What
hope
is
so.
it about Didon, the character, never mind Berlioz's magnificent music, but the character that pulls you in?
Well, I think the arc of the piece, you know, and the vulnerability and simultaneous strength, and of course the way, yes, Berlioz creates a character, you know, the way music conveys emotion and character. Um, yeah, I mean, what's like that? What role compares to that? It's sort of like a pinnacle for a mezzo. I mean, I know everyone says Carmen, and yes, I would love to do Carmen. I've only done it in concert with my husband once, which was fabulous. But I understand if that won't be my path as it is for so many others. I already accept that I'm on the slightly, you know, musician, maybe Wagner. I've been asked to do a little bit of Wagner, and I hope to do Fricka, and I hope to do Valtrauta, and I mean, who knows?
I forget the character's name, but in Meistersinger you sang
Yes,
I forgot
Magdalena.
Magdalena. That's right. Yeah.
That was great. So
Um,
fun.
well, to me, I always say that what Wagner and Verdi did, Berlioz and Rossini did first, and at least as well, but they don't
Yes.
get the credit. And so, if you're a good Rossini and Berlioz singer, then you have the makings of a Verdi and a Wagner singer.
Mm.
Um, Wagner didn't do too many great mezzo roles, in my
Right.
view. I think he slipped up on that. There were a few, but I don't want to see you as a Valkyrie unless you just want,
Right.
fun production. But there's not enough going on for mezzo as a Valkyrie.
Mhm.
Much better as Fricka or Valtrauta in Gotterdammerung. There's Mary and the Flying Dutchman, but not
Mhm.
really, not much there. Brangena in Tristan and Isolde, I think, would be
Incredible.
more interesting. She could be the pivotal person in that opera when it's done
Yes.
by the
True.
Petra Lang was a wonderful
Mhm.
Brangena. Tatiana Troyanos was an extraordinary Brangena. Um, I feel very fortunate that I began so young. You began very young in opera, that I got to work a lot with Tatiana Troyanos, because when I
Wow.
talk to mezzos now and they look back, if they do look back to the model, to the prototype, they always say Tatiana Troyanos. And I find that interesting because
Yes.
Crystal Ludwig, there were so many, Marilyn Horne, of course,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so many wonderful mezzos of that era.
Yeah.
But and especially for American artists, they always say Tatiana Troyanos,
Mhm.
unless they want to do Rossini and Handel, which then they would say Marilyn Horne.
Well, I think it's because Tatiana did so much, you
Mhm.
know. There seemed to be no limitations for her, and she was incredible in everything. I mean, wouldn't you say that was true?
Yeah. And she was a handful. And I mean that just in the
Yes.
best sense. I'm not a gossip, but she would commit 110%. And she would arrive as a bundle of nerves and energy and so on.
Mhm.
And she would bring all that fire to the stage. And whatever it was she does, Santuzza, the
Yes.
Tatiana Triano Santuzza was an arc of a character in 70 minutes that
Mhm.
no other artist I've ever seen achieve. Leone Reason, it came pretty close.
Yes.
But yeah, Santuzza, I mean. But um, there was just something unique about her as an artist, the colors and tones in the voice, but also to the degree that we have video of her. I always ask people to look at her curtain calls, because to me, the two greatest curtain callers in all of opera were both mezzos, Mignon Dunn and Tatiana Troyanos.
Really?
Dunn because she's still with us, thank goodness, but she had the same curtain call, but it was wonderful. She had a way of taking in at the Met every one of the 4,000 people in the theater. She somehow, in her 90-second call, caught all of their eyes and attention, and
Really?
arms would come out, and then she'd look up and she'd reach that way and move across, and then down to the dress circle and the grand tier and the parterre, and then the orchestra, and the arms would come out.
Whoa.
Troyanos always did her curtain call in character. So Octavian was a completely different one from Venus in Tannhäuser, and or Romeo. And she didn't get out of character very quickly. I think enough time has passed that I can tell the story about her. When we did Les Troyens in 1983 for the Met's opening of the centennial season, she and Domingo and Jesse Norman were scheduled for 4 performances. Then Domingo left, and later Norman would take over from Troyanos as Didon. And this was Jesse Norman's debut, and it was thrilling, and I wrote about it recently when she died. But Troyanos was the center. She was Didon. And we did a live transmission on television of one of the performances. And what happened was the last 22 minutes, which is the death of Dido at Dieu Fier Cité, when she says goodbye to the people of Carthage, and then she kills herself, and then the Trojans come, and the Italy, and they go off to Rome, and it's just a fantastic moment. There were tech problems, and they wanted to refilm the last 22 minutes to have archivally and for a better video and so on. And because there was a black line through it. And Troyanos had just been through this cathartic experience, cathartic in Carthage. And we had to ask her, can you summon that again? And ultimately, we were there till 2 a.m. The audience left, but we had all the crew there and everything because we wanted to record it archivally again. But she finally said, I just can't. It wasn't vocal. It said she had reached this feverish pitch, and the acting was so extraordinary. She said, I can't recreate that.
Wow.
So the video, when you buy it on DVD, is a combination of the black line plus a little bit of restoration from rehearsal.
Really?
But the vocal is all the performance, so that there's no compromise on that, because it was extraordinary. And people can see that on YouTube if they want, although I would have them buy the DVD. What other artists from, quote, the past are models to you?
Oh, so many. Baker, Krista Ludwig, Marian Anderson. It just escaped my mind, whom I love so much, who had a fuller instrument, who did Carabina, who did Octavian, who did, where's her name going? I'm sure you know what I mean.
Regine Crispin?
No, she was German. This is embarrassing. Fassbender.
Brigitte Fassbender? Okay.
Fassbender, I adore. And in terms of like mentioning singing Carabino, I think of people like her who have and did so many other things. Marilyn, of course, Cecilia. I mean, if we're talking, Simeonato.
Simeonato. There was someone who could sing everything, with Giulietta Simeonato.
Right. I mean,
very, very long life. She died just a few days shy of 100. Had a handsome young boyfriend at the end.
Oh, really?
Italian guy. They were together for quite a long time. And it was not Sunset Boulevard. It was not that at all. It was a very committed relationship.
Really?
Yeah.
I love Grace Bumbry too. I have all the Grace Bumbry recordings.
Bumbry and Shirley Verrett were often
Mhm.
paired as you contrast them, but they were both amazing artists on their own. Bunbury, for me, was often the person who awakened me to opera in certain roles, because I saw, for example, believe it or not, when I was 9 years old, Maria Callas sing Tosca, but it didn't affect me as much. Tito Gobi as Scarpia affected me, but not Callas somehow. It was the end of her career, and for whatever reason, it didn't do it. But my dad felt that I should hear Callas, and I'm glad that I went. But when I saw Grace Bunbury do Tosca a few years later in Vienna with Domingo and Cheryl Milnes, I was 19. That that was an amazing performance. Zubin Mehta
Wow.
conducting. When I saw Orfeo by Gluck in 1967 at the Met, she was Orfeo, and I was a kid. I was not even a teenager, and I that was part of what set me on the course to want to work in opera, was that Orfeo. Because for a child, if you say, and if you teach your children opera, I think Orfeo is a good one, it's about behavior. If you turn around, your loved one will die. So don't turn around.
Yeah.
Keep walking out of hell, leading your DJ out of hell, but don't turn around.
Right.
So I was completely focused on, would she turn and look or not? He turn and look or not? And years later, I got to interview her, and she said, "Do you remember my costume from that?" I said, "No." It was, I looked it up. It was a silver costume with a silver cape and silver boots. She said, "I looked like Muhammad Ali about to go into a fight."
Gosh. Speaking, I know we talked a little bit about pronouns and controversial things like the transgender experience. And I wrote her an email once because I was called a racist a couple years ago for performing a Copland song in recital. And this sort of kind of brings the conversation full circle, because we were talking about how, coordinazione could be meaningful as long as you invest in it, and that new pieces have so much to do with what's going on. And this student who started this complaint about racist said that I hadn't given an introduction to Chingering Cha, because in the program, little did I know that they'd put minstrel song in parentheses. And someone connected me to Grace Bunbury, of course, who had premiered the orchestral version with Copland. And she wrote back the kindest email. I told her about my experience. And I was really upset at the time, to be called that, and just had no idea that there might be anything that could be offensive about it, especially since it's an uplifting song. And she said, "Just put that out of your mind. I never thought minstrel was associated with it. Just make sure it's not in any program and go on singing it." And it was just simple, short, and confident. And that's just my little Grace Bunbury story, which was kind of bizarre that I got to connect with her for a moment. But anyway.
Well, I have many, many. She was very influential on me in terms of how to take and hold a stage, and how to excite an audience, and the energy, the innate sense of drama in her bones, plus the great voice and the training that she had at the Music Academy of the West. And now she's a great teacher. She's quite something. She's really a force of nature. She once said to me, we were talking about something that we were supposed to do together, but it didn't work out because of any number of opera budget reasons. And she said, "La Forza del Destino." That's them's the breaks, basically. La Forza del Destino.
Well, also, I would be mistaken if I didn't say Jessie Norman too. Especially since becoming a little bit concert heavy, I look at everything she's done, and I relate to her. Just what she performed. I do a lot of that repertoire. And once I was in Geneva on tour. I know we have to watch the time, and there was a review that said, I think it was Mahler 3. I was touring with San Francisco Symphony, and they said, "Well, she's not Jessie Norman, but," and I thought, okay, for the rest of the tour, I am going there. I'm going to think of her spirit and her presence and her utterance and way. And I do. I mean, it's like that owning your space thing we talked about. It's not ego, but it's about being present and being there. And she always had that, just that owning the room, confidence of the space.
Owning the world, never mind the room.
Totally.
I had the great honor to work with her a lot. We met at the Troyan in
Yeah.
'83, but then we worked together a lot. And when she died, I wrote a remembrance of her. Many listeners know that I'm at WQXR Radio here in New York.
Mhm.
And if you Google Fred Plotkin opera, you will find my page there. And I wrote a remembrance when she died, describing what made her particular, because she was unlike any other artist I'd ever worked with. She I wrote that you didn't as much know Jesse Norman as experience Jesse Norman.
Mm.
And that was not a jab at her. That was to say that there was a degree of distancing that she created to protect herself, but also to not reveal everything and to save a lot of it for the stage. I
Interesting.
also mentioned in the article that while the notion that singers are dumb is completely wrong, as people saw today, that you are smart in addition to every other talent you have, she was the most intellectual opera singer. There were two. Another one who I know, and people know him, and we love him. This guy and Jesse Norman are the two most intellectual opera singers I've ever come across.
Mm.
And she was very analytical. She knew everything about history, about everything. She was
Mhm.
widely read. She was not conventional. She was not what people would expect. And her memoir, which a lot of people didn't like, but I did because I felt it was candid, was notable for many things. But one was, apart from not discussing her weight very much, because it is what it is and was what it was, but she didn't talk too much about the experience of being an African American artist in the 60s and 70s. She mentioned it, but also said that she came from a loving middle class home in Georgia and was secure in that. And if other people were not, that was their problem. But
Mm.
what she spoke a lot more about was being a woman who was born in 1945 and the
Mhm.
challenges of being a woman and making a life and a career. She'd wanted to be a doctor, and her family
Really?
basically said to her, "You're not going to be a doctor, and you can sing, so
Yeah.
why don't you try singing?" And she, from her earliest day, understood that the oppression she faced, in her view, was not about her skin, but about her gender, her sex, the
Interesting.
fact that she was a woman.
Mhm.
And other people, could have said what they did about her weight and her color, but that was not what reached her as much as the fact that she was told she couldn't do things because she was a woman, or shouldn't do things because she was a woman. So I always invite people when they look at her career to see it also as you described, as the allure of the feminine and the mystery and the beauty and the inexplicability, if that's a word.
Yeah, it is.
It is a word, and that's what it is, but that's part of the fascination.
Yeah.
And you, Sasha Cooke, I will just mention very quickly that you've provided a wonderful list of listening, a lot of it Russian, because your parents are professors of Russian. I met your mother and Olga. And am I correct that you once said to me that on the other side you're related to Captain Cook?
Yes, that's right.
Tell us how you're related to Captain Cook.
They were missionaries and came
Yeah.
to Hawaii, and so my way back, my dad's side, who ended up starting Castle and Cook, which was a sugar company in Hawaii. And then when my grandfather, anyway, I still have a Hawaiian connection. And it's funny because when I go to the islands, I'll mention Cook, and there are people that are like, "Oh, Cook, you're a cook." I'm like, "Well, yeah." And I think you probably know more than I do, but that's the short story. So yeah.
Well, I years ago had the opportunity, except that I was elsewhere booked, but I would have loved to take the opportunity to work at the opera in Hawaii in February. I've never been to Hawaii, and I've always wanted to,
Oh,
especially we were talking about acronyms before: Ethical Grand Opera, EGO, Hawaii Opera Theater, HOT.
hot. I know. Don't you love that?
February, the notion of working at HOT in Hawaii eating pineapple was
You
very
need to
appealing.
go. You need to go.
Yeah. Sasha, it is wonderful to see you from afar. I hope that many listeners who didn't know you will now know you and understand how special you are and find your music on IDAGIO, where there are performances of yours, and elsewhere. And when we can get on planes and trains and buses and ships again to hear you where you're performing.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, and give my
Oh,
love to your family, especially your
it was
mom.
such a pleasure. It was so fun. You're so wonderful.
So we're going to leave, and I'll see you soon. And
See you,
guests,
Fred.
next week, I have a wonderful guest, Francesco Cilufo. If you don't know him, you will love him.
Amazing.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thanks, Fred.
Bye-bye.